The laughter of the hotel staff still echoed faintly in the marble lobby long after the man had left. They had dismissed him as another pretender, someone who looked too ordinary to belong in a place where rooms cost more than most people's monthly salaries. The manager, flushed with self-satisfaction, poured himself a glass of water and leaned casually against the counter, recounting the scene to a bellboy who hadn't been there to witness it. "You should have seen his face," he said, smirking. "The nerve of him offering to pay double, as if we're that desperate." His colleagues chuckled, feeding his ego further, and soon the incident was forgotten amid the usual rush of arrivals and departures. But somewhere beyond the grand doors of the hotel, the man they had mocked was being driven away in silence, his calm eyes reflecting the city lights as his driver navigated through the busy streets. He didn't look angry, just thoughtful, as though mentally noting every detail of what had transpired. The following morning began like any other. The sun filtered through the glass ceiling of the hotel's atrium, casting golden reflections on the polished floors. The staff moved briskly, preparing for the arrival of a new set of VIP guests. The manager was in his element, directing everyone with his usual confidence, unaware that the day was about to twist into something unforgettable. Around mid-morning, an email pinged on his computer. The subject line read, "Urgent Financial Review Parent Bank Audit Team. Visit today." He frowned, immediately calling the accounting department for clarification. The staff explained nervously that the bank that owned the hotel's mortgage had scheduled a surprise audit. The manager grumbled but brushed it off. "Just another group of clipboard-carrying suits," he said, straightening his tie. "We'll dazzle them with numbers and coffee." By noon, the atmosphere had shifted. The general manager arrived unexpectedly, unusually tense, and began pacing the lobby. He instructed everyone to be on their best behavior, hinting that someone very important was coming along with the auditors. The words carried weight. The staff exchanged nervous glances. Whispers spread like ripples. The manager laughed it off at first, confident that his charm and efficiency would impress anyone. But that confidence began to waver when the convoy of sleek black cars appeared outside. The uniformed driver stepped out first, opening the door to reveal a familiar face, the same man who had been turned away the night before. For a moment, the manager froze. His body went rigid, his mouth slightly open as recognition hit him like a physical blow. The man was dressed differently this time. A crisp suit, polished shoes, and a subtle watch that spoke of wealth without ostentation. Behind him followed two senior auditors carrying folders embossed with the bank's insignia. The general manager rushed forward to greet him, bowing slightly as he addressed him by name and title. The words CEO of the bank rang through the lobby like thunder. Every pair of eyes turned toward the manager, who stood pale and motionless behind the desk. The receptionist beside him whispered under her breath, "That's him, the man from last night." The CEO greeted the general manager with a calm handshake, his tone professional but cool. His gaze then shifted, landing on the manager who had mocked him. For a second, their eyes met the manager's full of dread. The CEO's filled with the quiet authority of someone who no longer needed to explain himself. The silence that followed was suffocating. Guests paused mid-conversation. Staff froze in place. Then, with composed precision, the CEO said, "I'd like to begin the inspection in the lobby." His voice was smooth, steady, but carried an unmistakable edge. The auditors began their work immediately, noting down details, asking for documents, and inspecting service logs. The CEO walked slowly around the area, his eyes scanning every corner with an air of detachment. The manager tried to compose himself, straightening his jacket and forcing a polite smile, but his hands trembled slightly. When the CEO finally turned to him, he spoke softly. "You work here, don't you?" The manager swallowed hard and nodded. "Yes, sir. I'm the front desk manager." The CEO tilted his head slightly. "Ah, yes. I remember." The simplicity of the words carried more weight than any reprimand could have. The staff shifted uncomfortably. Sensing the tension, the general manager tried to diffuse the moment, quickly stepping in to explain their commitment to customer service and hospitality standards. But the CEO raised a hand, silencing him gently. "Customer service," he repeated quietly, almost to himself. "An interesting concept." He then looked back at the manager. "Would you say every guest deserves respect here?" The question was direct, but the tone remained calm. The manager hesitated before answering, his voice trembling. "Of course, sir. We treat all our guests with equal respect." The CEO's eyes narrowed slightly, and a faint, almost imperceptible smile touched his lips. "Equal respect," he echoed, then turned away and continued his tour. Every minute felt like an hour for the manager. He followed at a distance, trying to stay out of sight while still appearing attentive. The other employees watched in silence, their earlier arrogance replaced with uneasy guilt. The CEO's calmness was more terrifying than anger. He didn't raise his voice, didn't call anyone out directly. He simply observed, took notes, and asked quiet, piercing questions that exposed every flaw in their operation. When the audit was done, he called the general manager aside and handed him a folder. Inside was a memorandum stating that the hotel's service quality was under review due to multiple customer complaints and staff misconduct reports, including recent behavior witnessed firsthand. The general manager's face drained of color as he read the document. "Sir," he began, but the CEO interrupted gently. "I'm not here to punish anyone. I'm here to remind you that hospitality is built on humility." His eyes flicked toward the front desk, where the manager now stood frozen, his earlier pride replaced with silent regret. The CEO then turned toward the exit, pausing briefly near the door. The entire staff stood still, unsure whether to speak or stay silent. "Treat every guest," he said softly, as if they might own the place, because one day, they just might. When the cars finally drove away, the silence that filled the lobby was heavy and sharp. The manager felt every pair of eyes on him. The same people who had laughed with him the night before now avoided his gaze. The receptionist who had mocked the man's old briefcase busied herself shuffling papers, pretending not to notice him. Even the bellboy who had admired him now looked away. The general manager approached slowly, holding the memorandum in his hand, his expression a mixture of anger and disbelief. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" he said quietly, his voice trembling. The manager couldn't answer. His throat felt dry, his chest tight. He knew there was nothing he could say to erase what had happened. That night, the hotel lobby was unusually quiet. The chandelier still glimmered, the fountains still flowed, but the usual air of superiority was gone. The staff spoke in hushed tones, avoiding the front desk where the manager sat, staring blankly at the monitor. His reflection stared back at him. Same uniform, same name tag, but the confidence was gone. He remembered the CEO's calm eyes, the quiet dignity with which he had handled the humiliation. The realization cut deep. In a single day, everything had turned upside down. The man he mocked had been the one with true power, and the laughter that once echoed in the lobby now existed only as a memory of arrogance stripped bare by truth. When the man walked out of the hotel that night, nobody in the lobby could have guessed that the moment they mocked him would soon turn into the biggest lesson of their lives. The manager, puffed up with pride, leaned against the counter, recounting the scene to his subordinates as if it were a story worth laughing about. He exaggerated every detail, imitating the man's calm tone and shabby clothes, his words dripping with ridicule. The receptionist laughed until tears rolled down her cheeks, the bellboys joined in, and even a few guests smirked, enjoying the spectacle. To them, it was just another evening in their world of luxury where appearance mattered more than substance. An arrogance passed for sophistication. Outside, the man walked quietly to his waiting car. A black sedan parked discreetly by the curb. The driver stepped out immediately, holding the door open with a respectful bow. The man got in, his movements slow and composed, his briefcase resting on his lap. As the car began to move, he looked out of the tinted window at the glowing hotel sign. The same establishment that owed millions in loans to the very institution he led. His mind wasn't filled with anger, but with a quiet disappointment. He had visited unannounced to observe the service standards of a hotel under his bank's financing portfolio. What he found instead was arrogance wrapped in uniforms and titles. He didn't need to raise his voice or demand respect. The system he oversaw would do that for him soon enough. By morning, news of an unscheduled audit began to circulate through the hotel's internal communication system. The accounting team whispered about a surprise inspection from their parent bank, the very institution responsible for approving the hotel's next expansion project. The general manager, alarmed, arrived early, barking orders to the staff to ensure everything looked perfect. "No mistakes today," he warned sharply. "Every smile must look genuine, every surface spotless. We cannot afford to look unprofessional." The manager from the previous night nodded nervously. Feeling a faint unease he couldn't explain, the lobby transformed into a stage of forced politeness and controlled chaos. The scent of freshly cut flowers filled the air. The chandeliers sparkled brighter than usual, and every employee wore their best expression of humility. At noon, the sound of polished shoes echoed against the marble floor as a convoy of black cars arrived outside. From the front vehicle stepped the same man they had ridiculed the night before. He was dressed elegantly now, in a tailored navy suit, his quiet demeanor unchanged but his presence commanding instant respect. The general manager rushed to greet him, bowing slightly as he extended his hand. "Welcome, sir," he said with a nervous smile. "We've been expecting you." The man's handshake was firm but brief. "Let's begin the review," he replied evenly. Every staff member froze as realization spread like wildfire. Whispers rippled through the lobby. "That's him," one of the receptionists whispered, her face pale. "The same man from last night." The manager's knees felt weak, his throat tightening as his heart thudded in panic. The man he had mocked wasn't some wandering traveler or lowly guest. He was the CEO of the bank that held their hotel's mortgage, the same institution financing their luxury upgrades. His authority stretched beyond the lobby, beyond the building itself. The manager forced himself to smile, but the sweat forming on his forehead betrayed his composure. The CEO walked calmly through the lobby, his eyes scanning every corner. The auditors behind him began taking notes, requesting access to financial records, reviewing service logs, and interviewing staff. The atmosphere turned tense. Every word, every movement was measured. The CEO's silence was more unsettling than anger would have been. When he finally turned to the manager, his voice was soft, yet cutting through the air like glass. "We met last night, didn't we?" he asked. The manager stammered. Why, yes, sir. I didn't realize. The CEO raised a hand, stopping him. No need to explain, he said calmly. You made your assessment quickly. I suppose that's your standard procedure. The manager's face turned crimson as the entire staff pretended to look busy, trying to avoid eye contact. The CEO continued walking, glancing occasionally at the decor, the service counters, and the staff interactions. He asked simple questions about guest handling, policy on walk-ins, training procedures, but each one carried a subtle weight, a reminder that his presence wasn't just observational. It was evaluative. The general manager followed closely, attempting to smooth over the tension with overly enthusiastic explanations. Yet the CEO's quiet demeanor left no space for flattery or excuses. After an hour, the group settled in the conference room where the CEO reviewed the financial statements. The manager was called in to answer a few questions about guest service protocols. His hands trembled slightly as he spoke, each word sounding less confident than the last. The CEO listened without interrupting, occasionally jotting notes in a leather-bound folder. When the manager finished his nervous explanation, the CEO simply said, "Service is the soul of hospitality. Numbers can build a hotel, but character sustains it." The words weren't angry or loud, they were spoken with the weight of authority and experience. The manager could only nod, his earlier arrogance replaced by shame so heavy he could barely stand straight. Once the audit concluded, the CEO stood and shook hands with the general manager, offering polite but distant smiles. Before leaving, he turned one last time, toward the staff gathered in the lobby. "A place of service," he said quietly, "should never measure worth by appearance. The richest man can dress like the poorest traveler, and the poorest can carry dignity worth more than gold." His words lingered in the air long after he stepped outside. The staff bowed respectfully, their faces pale, their pride shattered as the convoy of cars departed. The silence that filled the lobby was unlike anything the hotel had ever experienced. The usual sound of soft music and chatter felt muted under the weight of realization. The general manager dismissed everyone but called the front desk manager into his office. The confrontation was brief and cold. "You've embarrassed this hotel," he said quietly, holding a printed memo from the CEO's office. "Your behavior was unprofessional and unacceptable. The man you mocked last night now questions whether this establishment deserves the bank's continued trust." The manager couldn't respond. His throat was dry, his vision unfocused. The weight of his arrogance pressed down like a stone. That evening, as he walked out of the same glass doors where he once stood proudly, the world outside felt different. The laughter that had filled the air last night was gone. The city lights shimmered faintly on the wet pavement, and the reflection of the hotel's glowing sign blurred in his tired eyes. He thought of the man's calm smile, the dignity with which he carried himself, the quiet authority that needed no display of power. The truth stung deeper than any reprimand. The man he had dismissed as poor was wealthier than anyone he'd ever met, not just in money, but in composure and wisdom. The receptionist watched him leave, her earlier amusement replaced by silent remorse. The bellboy, too, stood quietly, avoiding his gaze. The same people who once admired his arrogance now saw through it. The hotel's grandeur suddenly felt hollow, its shine dulled by the humility that had been missing all along. Somewhere in a high-rise office overlooking the city, the CEO was back at work. His focus already shifted to other matters. But the hotel staff would not forget his visit. They would remember the night they mocked a stranger who turned out to be their master in disguise, the night pride cost them their dignity, and humility returned to collect its due. The next morning began with an unusual tension that even the grand chandeliers of the hotel couldn't mask. The staff moved briskly, their footsteps echoing through the marble lobby, but their faces betrayed unease. Rumors had already spread from the top floor down to the housekeeping department. A senior bank official was visiting for a personal inspection. The manager, who had spent most of the night rehearsing his excuses in front of the mirror, tried to maintain composure. His arrogance had melted into a thin layer of forced confidence. He straightened his tie repeatedly, barking soft orders at his team to polish, adjust, and perfect every visible detail. The scent of fresh lilies mixed with the faint tang of nervous sweat that hung in the air. Every corner gleamed, every voice was lowered, and yet nothing could prepare them for the moment. When the glass doors parted once more, the man who had been humiliated just a day earlier stepped into the same lobby. But this time, everything about him radiated authority. He wasn't dressed in the simple clothes from before. Instead, he wore a sharp gray suit that fit him perfectly, his posture commanding but calm. The same staff who had laughed behind his back now stood frozen in place, their eyes wide with disbelief. The manager's lips parted, but no sound came out. It was as if the air itself had thickened, trapping his words in his throat. Behind the man followed two other individuals' assistants with folders, their expressions serious and focused. The general manager came rushing out from the back office, shaking hands with the visitor like greeting royalty. "Sir, it's an honor to have you here," he said, bowing slightly. The visitor returned a polite smile, glancing briefly toward the front desk where the manager stood trembling. The truth hit the staff like a wave. The man they had mocked was no ordinary guest. He was the CEO of the bank that financed the hotel, the very institution holding the keys to their financial lifeline. The general manager knew it, and so did the trembling employees who had laughed at his expense. The CEO walked slowly, his shoes clicking against the marble, his gaze sweeping over the lobby that now seemed smaller, less grand, under his quiet scrutiny. The staff bowed respectfully as he passed. Their earlier laughter, a memory they desperately wanted to forget. The manager tried to steady his breathing, hoping that somehow the CEO wouldn't recognize him, but when their eyes met, the faintest trace of a smile curved on the CEO's lips, not one of amusement, but of acknowledgement. The general manager began explaining the hotel's current status, the renovations, the upcoming expansion plans funded by the bank. The CEO listened patiently, nodding occasionally, though his expression gave away nothing. After a moment, he turned his gaze toward the reception desk. "I'd like to see how you handle guests," he said simply. The manager felt his stomach drop. It wasn't a request, it was an order, one layered with meaning that only he fully understood. He tried to keep his hands steady as he greeted a new guest who had just arrived, but his voice cracked slightly. Every move he made, every word he said, felt watched, measured, and silently judged by the man he had once dismissed as unworthy of service. When the brief demonstration ended, the CEO said nothing. He simply nodded, turned to his assistants, and continued the inspection through the corridors, the restaurant, and the suites. He asked questions that revealed how deeply he understood not only the business side of the establishment, but the human element as well. His tone was never raised, his demeanor never aggressive. Yet each of his words carried a quiet weight that made everyone listen with full attention. Even the general manager, a man used to commanding others, seemed humbled in his presence. Hours passed, and the inspection moved to the boardroom, where the CEO reviewed documents, financial summaries, and service records. The manager was called in once more, this time to explain a particular incident regarding guest treatment policies. His voice trembled as he spoke, the memory of the previous night flashing in his mind. He tried to sound professional, but every phrase came out rehearsed and hollow. The CEO listened silently, occasionally exchanging a glance with his assistant. When the manager finished, the room fell quiet for a long, unbearable moment. Then the CEO said softly, "Hospitality is not a business of appearances. It's a business of empathy." The words were delivered without anger, yet they landed with the weight of a judgment. When a guest walks in, they don't owe you their story. They owe you only respect, and it must be returned. The manager lowered his gaze, his throat tightening with shame. There was nothing he could say that wouldn't sound like an excuse. He had built his entire sense of worth around status, and now, in front of the man he had humiliated, that illusion had crumbled completely. The CEO closed the folder in front of him, his expression unreadable, then rose to his feet. "I'll have my office follow up on this location," he said to the general manager. "There are a few matters of conduct that require review." The tone was neutral, but everyone in the room understood what it meant. The audit wasn't just about finances anymore, it was about integrity. When they returned to the lobby, the CEO paused near the reception desk. The entire staff stood silently, their posture rigid, their eyes lowered. The marble floor gleamed beneath the golden light, but the atmosphere felt heavy, subdued. The CEO turned to the manager once more and spoke quietly. "Yesterday, you had a chance to represent your brand. Instead, you represented your prejudice. Learn from that." The manager nodded, unable to lift his eyes. The CEO didn't linger after that. He simply nodded to the general manager and walked toward the doors, his assistants following behind. The revolving glass doors reflected his calm figure as he stepped into the bright afternoon light, leaving behind a silence so deep it felt like an echo of his presence would never fade. The manager stood still for several seconds, unable to move. Around him, no one spoke. Even the receptionist who had once joined in mocking the man, now stared at the floor, guilt etched across her face. The bellboy shifted nervously, remembering the laughter that now seemed cruel and childish. Slowly, the weight of the moment settled over everyone. They had been exposed not by a public outburst or a reprimand, but by a single man's dignity and restraint. Later, in the privacy of the general manager's office, the confrontation came. The general manager's voice was low and controlled, but it trembled with suppressed anger. "Do you understand what you've done?" he said. "You insulted the one man whose signature keeps this hotel standing." The manager nodded weakly, but words wouldn't come. His arrogance had dissolved into a deep, painful shame. He left the office feeling smaller than he ever had before. That night, when the lights dimmed and the guests retired to their rooms, the manager walked through the now empty lobby. The same marble floor that had once echoed with his confident stride now reflected his quiet, uncertain steps. He paused where the CEO had stood, looking at his own reflection in the glass doors. For the first time, he saw not a proud employee of a grand establishment, but a man who had forgotten what it meant to serve with humility. Outside, the city lights shimmered faintly, and somewhere beyond them, the CEO was likely back in his office, continuing his work, unfazed by the drama he had left behind. But in that quiet moment, standing beneath the fading glow of the chandelier, the manager understood the weight of what had happened. He had mocked a stranger who held the power to decide his future, But more than that, he had mocked the very principles of respect and kindness that his profession was built upon.